Hello, my name is Spencer, and in my podcast called The Dictionary, I literally read from the dictionary, but add in my personal comments and stupid jokes to make it more interesting. Episodes are family-friendly, short, and air every single day on basically every podcast platform. Come join me on this journey filled with edutainment.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka.
And we are back for season 4. 5. Why did I think we were on season 4? My goodness, lost my ability to count.
Well, we have been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
You have, 2 or 3 other podcasts that we're in charge of as well.
We've been doing a lot of sorting through archives in our transition to having ads on here, which I'm sure you all probably have heard about by now. I have always really loved numbering episodes and being like, this is episode number this, and this is episode number that. And I think you do number using the episode number thing in the descriptions, but
yes,
it's not always in the title. And I kind of like that of all of our shows. This is the podcast that's really easy to jump into a random point. There isn't really a building of inside jokes or a building of weird fan theories, even a building of our opinions of stuff. I like that this is something where you don't need to remember all the numbers necessarily.
No, you don't. And that's how I've designed it, is that whenever I try to sell anyone on listening to the podcast, I immediately tell them that you do not need to go through the entire library of stuff.
Yeah.
You can just find a movie or a subject that you find interesting and you can listen to just that.
Yeah. And I'll always have a couple to throw out of oh, this was a really cool conversation. This was a really good episode. And because I feel like there's some that may not jump out to people as ooh, I got to listen to this, that ended up being really good discussions. I feel like Nimona certainly is something that has its fans, but isn't necessarily one of those big properties like a superhero. But that's an episode that I'm like, that one turned out really good. And I would recommend checking it out.
Yeah. Our superhero episodes are always a big hitter.
Yeah.
That's why I always end every season with a superhero. I always like using that. And we're both fans of superhero movies and comics and all that.
And I'm so excited for when we get to talk about superheroes, whatever our next episode is talking about a superhero, because I have now gotten into comics since the last time we recorded, and I have so much more knowledge and opinions on the whole world.
Yeah.
And it's great. It's great.
Yeah. I do admit that this season we are not opening with a superhero, but I do want to say that we are opening with a pretty big hitter.
Yeah.
Much like when we covered Jodorowsky's Dune, I think this is kind of on par with Dune.
I feel like this is another one of those legendary, oh, what if this movie got made? When people, especially film nerds, think about movies that were never finished, this is one that jumps to the top of those lists.
Yes. So before we jump into the subject, I do want to ask you, what do you know about the French Revolution from the late 1700s to the early 1800s?
I feel like I do not know a lot about the French Revolution. I feel like most of my perception of that is from Les Mis, which I know is also covering one really tiny sliver of stuff. I don't really know a whole lot about the French Revolution other than the big meme ideas that I feel like have permeated culture. I know there was guillotines, and I know there was a dude named Napoleon Bonaparte who did some stuff, and that's basically the extent of my knowledge.
Yeah, going into the research, I really knew nothing about the French Revolution. I watched Les Mis. I really don't know much about it. I know that Napoleon was pretty famous guy in France, but I didn't really understand any of it or what the reason was. But after doing all this research, I can see why Kubrick and why other historians, they are so obsessed with Napoleon Bonaparte.
The era is really interesting because it's happening around the time of the American Revolution, like pretty soon after the American Revolution. The American Revolution feels like one of the most, and maybe this is just my skewed version of history based off of what I learned in an American history class, but it seems like one of the most clean-cut revolutions, where it was like, this side was trying to break out of this side, and then they fought, and then they did, and now they're their own country. Whereas every other revolution in history was like a series of changing of power in different hands of a massive mess where it took decades for stuff to happen. Like, I know the Russian Revolution is also extremely complicated, and power changed hands a bunch of times between the Tsar and the Soviet Union.
It was basically coup after coup after coup, until finally they were just like, no more.
Yeah.
We're done.
I was listening to a podcast. I don't even remember what podcast, but somebody brought up something about Les Mis as being their only frame of reference for the French Revolution. And then somebody else was like, that is a French Revolution. That is like one tiny mini revolution that happened in that entire history. As an American growing up in American history class, I see all these other international revolutions as like too complicated to begin to understand, because it's like, no, my frame of reference is we threw some tea in the water and we fought a battle and now we're a country. That's it. That's all you got to do.
Napoleon, and we'll go into this eventually, but he went through, I think, 2 revolutions within his lifetime.
Yeah.
And he died fairly young.
The other thing that I know about Napoleon is that the one thing everybody knows about Napoleon is wrong, which is Napoleon being a short guy. That was something that I had always kind of heard as like, oh, that's the thing that everybody thinks, but isn't actually true. Napoleon wasn't actually that short. Behind the Bastards recently did a series on...
Was it Napoleon Bonaparte III?
His son or grandson or something, who was very short, and that's where the Napoleon complex idea comes from, is from an entirely different Napoleon. Which I didn't realize, like, oh, the idea of the Napoleon complex does come from somewhere. We just have the wrong Napoleon in pop culture.
Yeah. In actuality, he was about 5'6", and Napoleon Bonaparte III, I think, was around 5'2". So that's where we're getting that from.
Like 5'6", that's a little short, but nobody's going to think that's weird.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then before we go into the research, because I wanted not really to focus on Napoleon. Trust me, I did not do any research on Napoleon because I feel like the movie pretty well covers that.
Okay.
And kind of the revolution, but I didn't want to go into there. What I wanted to talk about specifically, because this is a movie podcast, I wanted to talk about Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah.
And I think trying to understand who he is, from where he came from, then explains why he was so obsessed with Napoleon, and kind of goes into his filmmaking. So what do you know about Stanley Kubrick?
I don't think I grew up with any Kubrick films, and I don't know if I had seen any of his movies until I went to film school. You know, since then have watched a lot of the classics, 2001 and Clockwork Orange and The Shining. Like, you know, I've seen a lot of the classic standard Kubrick movies. I've certainly heard a lot of stories about how he acted on set, and kind of also how he acts in just like generally his way his mind works. He seems like a very obsessive person, very like, I am going to make everything be exactly the way that I want it in every frame of this movie. His techniques are very studied for a reason of, you know, the way he composes a shot and the way he uses a camera. I feel like he's kind of regarded as like one of the most like intentional filmmakers. You know, there's this idea of artifice versus cinema verite, of like, you know, how artificial something is versus like letting things happen. As far as artifice goes, the most artifice you can do is animation, because that is literally where you have control over every little thing. Whereas cinema verite would be like filming stuff and just seeing what happens. And whenever you're dealing with real people, you are going to be somewhere in the middle of there, even closer to cinema verite, depending on things, because you can't control every little feature of the way a person looks, or every little feature of somebody acts, or you're finding sets most of the time, or finding locations as opposed to always building them. But Kubrick definitely seemed like the guy who was trying to be as artifice as you can possibly be with live action actors, of really wanting absolute control over every little minute detail. There's lots of stories of actors who did not like working with him or that he traumatized, especially there's a lot of stories about The Shining.
I know with Shelley Duvall,
Yeah.
it was just a nightmare for her.
Yeah.
And even Jack Nicholson, which Stanley Kubrick got along with Jack
Yeah.
Nicholson just fine. And with Jack Nicholson, there's stories of him just being so exhausted
Yeah.
with Kubrick and just trying to figure out what he wanted to do. There's this famous story. I don't know how true this is, but there was a shot in The Shining where he just gets out of a vehicle and walks to the building. And for some reason, Kubrick had him do the take over 100 times because he just was not getting it right.
Yeah.
At some point, you just got to think, are people really paying attention? What is it specifically that you are looking for that he is just not portraying in just getting out of a vehicle and walking into a building?
Yeah, and I feel like that's one of the great debates on filmmaking. Do you let things happen and just kind of film what feels real? Do you go full Joe Swanberg of not even having a script and just letting everybody improv their dialogue versus doing the Kubrick route of being obsessive over every little detail? I will say Kubrick's whole thing of being so obsessive of every detail and those details being intentional, it really does make sense why he is such an important figure in film history, and also why he's probably the most studied filmmaker, because it is so apparent that everything is a choice, that nothing in those movies really happens by accident, or at least as few things as possible happen by accident. So it does make sense from that aspect why he is the most studied filmmaker ever, probably.
Yeah.
On a personal note, I kind of was realizing yesterday as I watched Barry Lyndon for the first time yesterday in preparation for this, and I had a realization of I have a lot of respect for Kubrick and I get the status he has in film history, but I don't think there's a single Kubrick movie that has left an impact on me, is something that I would call a favorite movie. It's all the movies, I'm yeah, I get what you're doing here and that's great. But for me personally, nothing in his movies connect to me in a way that I get out of my favorite movies or even other, filmmakers of the era. He exists kind of in a weird era where he's the end of old Hollywood and the beginning of new Hollywood and is kind of one of the bridges of that gap. He's just a filmmaker that none of his movies really do it for me.
I can see that. Barry Lyndon was one of those movies that really tests your stamina for
Yes.
watching Stanley Kubrick movies.
I will be totally honest and say it was extremely difficult for me to get through that movie because it was just so slow and drawn out. And it's I get why you're making this drawn out. It makes sense for the kind of movie you're trying to make, but it's not holding my attention at all.
When you have a duel that lasts for 30 minutes long, I'm just I think we can shorten this up a bit.
Well, honestly, that duel at the end was the most interesting part of the movie for me. I don't know, that actually kept me engaged because there was actual tension in the scene that I could feel, but there's so much of setup, narrator explaining basic things while characters are just sitting in a still frame for 2 minutes. I know why I'm watching this. I get what you're trying to do, Kubrick, but it's just not working for me.
Yeah.
I guess I'm too ADHD. I want the filmmakers that give me lots of stuff happening all the time. Give me a Scorsese movie any day where it's just things are happening.
Yeah.
That's the kind of movie that I love.
Yeah. I will say in defense of that, the way that he shot the movie, he drew a lot of inspiration from a lot of portraits, paintings. And if you take frames from that movie, and you could basically just put that in a frame and it looks like a painting.
Yeah, that's definitely something I knew about. Are you familiar with the YouTube channel Cinefix?
That sounds familiar.
They do these movie lists of top 10 chase scenes
or
top 10 base uses of color or something. But
I've seen a few of them, yeah.
I really, really enjoy that channel because they're coming to all their lists from a place of really being students of film and really being film nerds, but they also do this fun thing where everything that gets one of their 10 spots, they're listing 7 other movies that could be in that spot and pointing out cool things about them. I really enjoy that channel. But Barry Lyndon is a movie that comes up a lot, that they bring up a lot, especially when it comes to cinematography and framing and stuff. And they did a video where they were pointing out, literally showing side by side, here's a frame from Barry Lyndon and here is a Renaissance painting. And not that Barry Lyndon was directly, we're going to make this frame copy exactly this painting, but just to show like the way it's staged, the way people are framed, the way the space is, the way the light and shadows are, is very much emulating these Renaissance paintings.
Yeah. I watched the behind the scenes of it, and they said the thing that made it so revolutionary in film history was that you weren't just lighting a scene in an area. You had to think of the fact that this is a period piece in which electricity was not around. So the only light source is going to either be the sunlight from the outside or candlelight when it is nighttime.
Yeah, yeah.
And for that, they didn't invent this, but Zeiss had come out with a low light lens. It was a 50 millimeter f.95.
Okay. Wow.
And it was for scientific use. It wasn't even used for film cameras. So they had to find a way to mount that lens onto a camera in order for them to shoot with candlelight.
Wow. That's really impressive. So they actually lit it only with candlelight and natural lighting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So they ended up taking that technique, and that's what they ended up using in, I believe, Eyes Wide Shut.
Okay.
That's kind of where it started, was like that low light and being able to shoot with candlelight. Just knowing that part, I think, is one of the most impressive things about that movie.
Absolutely. That's really cool. I didn't know that going into it.
So yeah, let's start getting into it. But before we get into the history of Stanley Kubrick, we are actually going to stop for ads.
It's an ad break.
And we're back. All right, let's talk about Stanley Kubrick then. Stanley Kubrick was born on July 26, 1928 in Manhattan to a Jewish family. He grew up upper middle class in the Bronx, with his father being a homeopathic doctor. Although he descended from Polish and Romanian Jewish immigrants, he did not have a religious upbringing and proclaimed later that he had an atheistic view of the universe. At a young age, he read Greek and Roman mythology and Grimm's fairy tales. Although he was intelligent, he did perform poorly in school, mostly from lack of interest. When Stanley was about 12, his father taught him how to play chess, a game that he continued to play for the rest of his life and would actually later become a member of the United States Chess Federation.
This story is just checking off all the boxes that you hear in every, this genius's childhood. Oh, he did poorly in school because it didn't interest him. Oh, he was really good at chess. It seems like the way a music biopic always has to, have the same beats in every artist. It's like any story of a quote-unquote genius always has to hit these same points.
Yeah. It's like CEOs in the tech firm. All of them need to be dropouts out of college or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. Kubrick explained that chess helped him develop, quote, patience and discipline when it came to making decisions. At 13, his father gifted him a Graflex camera, which sparked his interest in photography. Soon after, he befriended his neighbor, Marvin Traub, who was also interested in photography and had his own darkroom. I feel like he was just using him for his darkroom, though. Together, their friendship grew over the same interests, which also included movies, which they would watch together at the local theaters. For a short time, Kubrick developed an interest in jazz and attempted to pursue a career as a drummer, but that never panned out. At William Howard Taft High School, he attended from 1941 to 45. There, he actually joined their photography club and would take photos for the school's magazine. By the time he graduated, he actually had a D+ average. So,
all right.
Yep, being a poor student, but actually a secret genius.
Yep.
One of the biggest reasons for performing so poorly is because he would oftentimes skip school to watch double features in the movie theaters. He would never pursue higher education after high school due to his poor grades, and with the influx of soldiers returning from World War II, getting into a university was actually much more competitive.
Sorry, I just thought of something when it comes to the genius biopic story beats. I feel like the narrative is oh, school wasn't challenging for them. When maybe it's that when somebody is really smart at something, they're generally not smart in everything.
No.
Maybe Stanley Kubrick was really, really good at making movies and actually was pretty bad at, math.
Yeah. Robert Evans, he is the host of Behind the Bastards. He talks about being a genius in different aspects where
Oh, yeah.
because he's doing so much research on dictators and all these evil and terrible people, even though they might be lacking in intelligence in many different areas, there's usually one specific area that they are a genius in.
Yep.
And that's the thing that elevates them to the top.
Yep. That's definitely a thing that I think our culture is getting better at, is recognizing like, hey, when somebody is very smart in one thing, doesn't necessarily mean that they know everything about everything.
Yes. Being a genius is relative.
Yes. Yes.
Although his father was disappointed, he did encourage Stanley to continue reading books from the family library and to pursue photography seriously. After high school, although he did not fully enroll in college, he did briefly attend a few evening classes at City College of New York.
Mm-hmm.
He sold a series of photos to Look magazine, which were published in 1945. And as a main way to earn income, he would play chess for money in Washington Square Park and various Manhattan chess clubs.
That's fun.
In 1946, Kubrick became an apprentice for the photographer G. Warren Schlott Jr. at Look magazine. The way that Kubrick would take photos was through storytelling. The first series that Look magazine published after Stanley was employed was titled A Short Short in a Movie Balcony. It was published on April 16th, 1946. The story was a stage setting about a man moving closer to a woman in a theater, and in the end, he ends up getting slapped. And this is all shown in about 4 different photos. Basically, it's a guy who just doesn't understand boundaries and just gets hits in the face. Yeah. In another assignment, he took photos of patients waiting in a dental office. And in 1948, he was sent to Portugal for a travel piece, and he covered a Ringling Bros and a Barnum and Bailey circus show in Sarasota, Florida. Some of his more memorable work as a photographer came from when he photographed a boxing match featuring Walter Cottier. He did a series in Chicago titled Chicago City of Extremes. He also photographed multiple jazz musicians like Frank Sinatra, Errol Garner, George Lewis, Eddie Condon, Phil Napoleon.
Phil Napoleon?
Yeah. Papa Celestin, Alphonse Pocchio, Muggsy Spanier, Sharkey Bonanno, and many more. In 1948, Kubrick married his high school sweetheart, Toba Metz, and lived in a small apartment in Greenwich Village. Although Kubrick loved photography, he was still interested in film and would often watch movies at the Museum of Modern Art and the various New York City theaters. He was inspired by the camera work seen in Max Ophuls films, and Kubrick described Elia Kazan as America's best director at that time. His focus then gravitated to reading books and taking notes all about film theory. Around 1951, Kubrick was looking to make his own short film based on Homer's Iliad. With the help of his friend Alex Singer, an employee of the newsreel production company, the March of Times, they estimated that the film would cost about $40,000 to make. Seeing that Stanley Kubrick only had about $1,500 in savings, there was no way that that was going to happen. Instead, Kubrick looked into making documentaries. His first documentary was a 16-minute film about the boxer Walter Cottier, a boxer he had photographed prior to, titled Day of the Fight. Stanley knew nothing about filmmaking and he had to learn on the fly. He had to learn where to rent equipment, where to buy film, laboratories that would process that film, how to light a shot, etc. According to Paul Duncan, author of Stanley Kubrick, The Complete Films, the film was, quote, remarkably accomplished for a first film. The short also includes a backwards tracking shot with Cottier and his brother walking towards the camera, a technique that Kubrick would often use in his later films. In the end, the film cost about $3,900 to make, and it was sold to RKO Pathy for $4,000. By making this film, Kubrick later claimed that the, quote, best education in film is to make one.
Yeah. Sorry, going back a little bit. I think it's interesting to hear about his history as a photographer and specifically at creating these narratives with photography. The thing that Kubrick is most known for is his mastery of the frame and intentionality of where everything is placed and how everything moves. And It feels very obvious that, of course, he would have this mindset with getting his start as having to tell a story using only still images. It makes perfect sense how that would lead into the way he uses the camera in his career. And also, it seems absolutely correct that the best way to learn how to make a movie is to make a movie.
I completely and solely agree with that. That is something that I learned when I was in high school, college.
Yep.
It was just me and my buddies going out with a camera.
Yep.
And the best way to learn how to edit is just give yourself a bunch of raw footage and just figure out how to put it together.
Yep. Dan, we need to start making a movie and have it not get finished. That way we know for this podcast, the best way to know how to not make a movie is to not make a movie.
So yeah, with the success, Kubrick quit his job at Look magazine and went on to filmmaking, learning everything he could from other New York City-based filmmakers at the time. Soon after, he began working on his next short, Flying Padre, which came out in 1951. It documented Reverend Fred Stedmuller, who travels 400 miles via a personal airplane to visit 11 churches. The film follows his journey as he performs a burial service, resolves a bullying issue between a little girl and boy, and makes an emergency flight to help transport a sick mother and her child. Kubrick made another short documentary, this time using color film, called The Seafarers, which came out in 1953, all about the day in the life about the Seafarers International Union. Some film historians believe Kubrick made other short documentaries, but these are the only ones that have been found. After screening his short films, Kubrick was able to raise $1,000 to make his first feature, The Trap, which he later renamed to The Shape of Fear, and finally settling on Fear and Desire, which was then released in 1953.
One by one, the men turned black. Then they were dead. And they knew it. I cannot quite admit that it is I who am creating slaughter in this abyss.
I just was going to point out how I think it's funny how that title feels very Hitchcock. I think it's that time period where like Hitchcock, there were probably a lot of movies that were using similar conventions, even though the plot isn't necessarily like a Hitchcock. Well, it's a little like a Hitchcock film.
Yeah. His friend Howard Sackler wrote the script, and Stanley's uncle, Martin Pervler, a Los Angeles pharmacy owner, invested $9,000 and was given an executive producer credit. Kubrick had a small crew, 5 actors, 5 crewmen, and 4 others to help with transportation, and shot the film within 5 weeks in the San Gabriel Mountains, which is located east of Los Angeles. The film follows 4 soldiers that crash land behind enemy lines, and one of those soldiers becomes infatuated with a girl in the woods and binds her to a tree. At one point during filming, Kubrick nearly killed the cast and crew by using insecticide to create fog.
With that insecticide, that reminds me of the story of Kurosawa dyeing the town's water supply so that way the rain would be the color that he wanted it to be. Have you ever heard that story?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, he went into this village, I think it was for Seven Samurai, and dyed the village's entire water supply black so that way it would show up better on film when using that water and their sprinklers for the rain and stuff. It was that level of I want it to look exactly like this, and so I'm going to endanger the lives of everybody around me.
We kind of do that today still when it comes to on-set rain. They'll oftentimes put white dye into the water and it helps reflect and it's much better seen.
But the difference is that we don't go to a town, dye their entire water supply, and then now they have to deal with black water for however long it takes.
Yeah. That's true.
Again, it's very much the old Hollywood moving into new Hollywood of the old Hollywood obsessives like Hitchcock, like Kubrick, and how they were we're going to terrorize our actors and put everybody's lives in danger for the movie. And then you get in the 70s and then people like Coppola try to do that. And then everybody as a whole starts to go, wait a minute, maybe we don't need to do that actually.
I just heard a story recently about The Notebook. This being the very first Nicholas Sparks movie. In that movie, there's a scene that takes place by a lake, and that lake has a bunch of swans in it.
Okay.
And in order for the swans to stay there, they actually had like a whole team raise those swans on that lake so that they would actually stay there during the shots and during the scene.
Wow.
It's like, yeah, that is quite a commitment just for like a scene.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the film was intended to be a silent film to save on costs. With the help of producer Richard de Rochemont, they got Foley, sound effects, and score added to the film. And then the budget for the film then soared up to $53,000. And in exchange, Kubrick would actually have to work on a miniseries to help pay this off called Omnibus, which was a biopic all about Abraham Lincoln. The film was a flop, but was critically acclaimed, especially the cinematography. Kubrick was later embarrassed by this film and actively stopped further prints of the film from being made. Kubrick's next idea was a boxing film that he co-wrote with Fear and Desire writer Howard Sackler, titled Killer's Kiss. The film was originally titled Kiss Me, Kill Me, and then they changed it to The Nymph and the Maniac before settling on Killer's Kiss.
All right.
All fowls are fair. As man meets murder in the stabbing, slashing climax, that's the payoff for a killer's kiss.
Because his first movie was not a financial success, Kubrick avoided asking for further investments for this film and had his friends and family invest $40,000 to make the film. Most of it from Morris Baus, a pharmacist in the Bronx. During production, Kubrick wanted to record sound on location to avoid the cost of creating sound in post. But with the restrictions of using a boom mic interfering with the camera movements Kubrick wanted and causing unwanted shadows, Kubrick did away with it. The decision cost him 7 months and $35,000 to create sound for the film after 14 weeks of shooting the picture.
Wow.
Kubrick later confessed that he was inspired by Alfred Hitchcock's Blackmail. And later, Martin Scorsese admitted that Raging Bull was inspired by Killer's Kiss.
Yep. Makes sense.
The film ended up costing $75,000 and didn't make much money in the box office. The critics, again, loved the cinematography, but they felt like the acting and the story was mediocre. Around 1955, Kubrick met producer James B. Harris while playing chess in Washington Square. Together, they formed the production company Harris Kubrick Pictures Corporation.
I love that he's still playing chess in the park.
Oh, yeah. I've heard stories before. I didn't have any research too much on him playing chess, but I know that like on set, he would also play chess as well, and oftentimes play chess with the actors.
Nice.
Just to kind of get a feel for them. They made the company Harris Kubrick Pictures Corporation. For their first project together, Harris purchased the rights to the novel Clean Break, which was written by Lionel White for $10,000, which Kubrick interpreted into a script with the help of film noir novelist Jim Thompson to help write the dialogue. The film they produced was The Killing, which came out in 1956.
I can't talk about it, Cherry.
You've been talking. Now you spilled to her.
I didn't honest. What, do you think I'm crazy? I wouldn't...
Jerk, you clown! Come on, clown, sing us a chorus from Pagliacci.
About a racetrack robbery gone wrong, starring Sterling Hayden. This film was considered Kubrick's first full-length feature film, shot with a professional cast and crew after they signed with the Jaffe Agency.
All right.
His previous films clocked in at about an hour, while The Killing was around 90 minutes. Because this was a professional set, the union in Hollywood prevented Kubrick from being both a director and cinematographer. Thus, they hired Lation Baylard. The film ended up costing $330,000 to make, and Kubrick waived his production fee to help lower the budget costs. While on set, Kubrick threatened to fire cinematographer Lucien Baylard over a camera dispute. The film was a flop, mostly due to last-minute marketing, and it was released all across the U.S., and it was the second feature film attached to Bandito, which also came out in 1956. The film was praised for its innovative cinematography, again. Later, critics would consider The Killing one of the best films Kubrick made in his early career.
Yeah, I feel like that's the only movie we've talked about so far that I've even heard of.
Yeah, a lot of these earlier films, like, I don't really know. I started to realize my shortcomings when it comes to the filmography of Stanley Kubrick. I only really know the big hitters.
Yeah. I think the earliest movie of his I saw was Spartacus.
Oh.
I'm looking at his IMDb right now. Spartacus, Doctor Strangelove, 2001, Clockwork Orange, Shining, and Barry Lyndon now. So
Yeah.
basically that whole string of like his well-regarded films.
Yeah. So Dor Sherry, who is a producer at MGM Studios, was so interested by the film that he offered $75,000 to James Harris and Stanley Kubrick to make another film. That film being Paths of Glory, which would come out in 1957.
I have only one last thing to say to you, George. The man you stabbed in the back is a soldier.
Based on Humphrey Cobb's 1935 anti-war novel.
Yeah, that's like a World War I movie, right?
Mm-hmm. The film had a rocky start trying to get the production going. The first obstacle being that MGM would not finance another war film after the film The Red Badge of Courage, which came out in 1951. Next, Sherry was fired from MGM. So Kubrick and Harris did get lucky when they caught the interest of Kirk Douglas to play the role of Colonel Dax for the movie. In return, Douglas signed Harris Kubrick Pictures to do a 3-picture deal for his production company, Brana Productions. The filming took place in Munich starting in March of 1957. One of the most complicated scenes they shot was a battle scene where hundreds of extras acting as soldiers had to make their way through no man's land. Kubrick set up the scene using 6 cameras running all at the same time and gave groups of extras areas in which they would die. Kubrick would operate his own camera and would zoom in and focus primarily on Kirk Douglas. The film was a commercial success. Although the film was criticized for being released on Christmas, it was banned in France for its unflattering depiction of the French military and was censored by the Swiss Army until 1970.
Wow.
Yeah. After premiering Paths of Glory, Kubrick was offered to make the adaptation of Herbert Emerson Winston's autobiography, I Stole $16 Million, about a Canadian church minister turned master safecracker. Kubrick wrote the script and titled it God-Fearing Man, but the film was never made. After that, Kubrick was contacted by Marlon Brando to make a film adaptation of the authentic death of Henry Jones, Charles Neater's novel about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Brando and Kubrick worked on the script for about 6 months. After multiple disputes, Kubrick walked away from the project, but Brando continued to make the film, which was later titled One-Eyed Jacks.
You're telling me that massive perfectionist personality Stanley Kubrick and massive perfectionist personality yeah, you're right, asshole is the more accurate description, but you're telling me that Kubrick did not get along with Marlon Brando? That's shocking. The moment that I heard that they were going to try making a movie together, I was like, this isn't going to happen. This is not going to go well. No. These two are not going to be able to like get along, and yep, that's what happened.
Yep, it did. In February 1959, Kubrick was offered to direct Spartacus, which came out in 1960.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
After Anthony Mann was fired from the film, a decision that cost Kirk Douglas $150,000 as a fee to replace him. The budget for the film was $6 million, which was definitely the most expensive film ever made in the US. And Kubrick was the youngest director in Hollywood to make this epic. He was actually 31 at the time that he was directing this film.
Wow. That's a movie that's like one of the great epics of that time period. You know, I know the chariot chase is super famous.
I mean, just the look of the film, actually what I have in my notes next is like, this is the first time that Kubrick has ever used anamorphic lenses and used 35 millimeter Technicolor film. Kubrick complained while on set that he was not given full creative control. Kubrick and Douglas also disputed over the script. Kirk at one point was upset over the fact that Kubrick cut all but 2 lines from the 30-minute opening.
Wow.
The film was completed and released in 1960. Bringing in $14.6 million in the box office and winning 4 out of the 6 Academy Awards that it was nominated for.
Yep.
After such a problematic production, Spartacus was the end of the Stanley Kubrick and Kirk Douglas working together.
Is that the only actor that Kubrick like reuses in movies? Because I feel like his movies are all pretty separate.
Kirk Douglas comes out just because Kirk Douglas was featured in Stanley Kubrick's movie, but it sounds like Kirk Douglas was like, this kid is great. Let's bring him on to finish up my movie. I know he's going to do a good job, but
Yeah.
seeing that he came in at such a late time where he just didn't really have control, they really just needed someone on set to like say action and cut and just make sure that the film was like, it looked good.
Yeah.
Harrison Kubrick moved on and began working on the next film, a black comedy titled Lolita, which came out in 1962.
Voila! My yellow roses, my daughter. Darling, turn that down, please. I can offer you a comfortable home, a sunny garden, a congenial atmosphere, my cherry pies.
Based on the Vladimir Nabokov novel. It was under the production of Elstree Studios and Warner Brothers.
Elstree Studios.
Yeah.
I just know that because that's where Star Wars was filmed.
With this change, this gave Kubrick complete creative control, but was met with many restrictions from censors and had to cut out many of the erotic elements in the film. In the box office, the film earned $3.7 million, with the production costing about $2 million. Yet again, Kubrick's film was not a commercial success, but was critically acclaimed. So, starting to see a pattern here. Kubrick took another stab at a black comedy, this time with Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, which came out in 1964.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
That's one of those movies that's like, yes, this is a comedy, and there's like a couple of scenes that feel like a comedy now, but watching it, it's like, okay, I don't know if this is just because it's jokes that are outdated now and are of their era, or is it that like Stanley Kubrick just isn't a very funny filmmaker? I can't decide. Like, I could see what Peter Sellers is trying to do, and there's like a couple of other scenes that's like, yes, this feels like a comedy. It doesn't feel like a comedy for 90% of the movie for me personally.
Maybe Kubrick just has a weird sense of humor.
Yeah,
that we
yeah.
It don't fully understand.
Just be me. Just be my sensibilities. Just don't match up the same.
Yeah. This film, it grew out of the fear of the Cold War, which happened in the 50s, a fear that nearly made him move to Austria, knowing that New York City would be a target of Russian nuclear bombs. To research the subject, he had to read over 40 military and political research books to come to the conclusion that, quote, nobody really knew anything and the whole situation was absurd.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yep. To help with the script, Kubrick collaborated with Peter George, who wrote Red Alert, a book about the threat of nuclear war and how easy it is to be triggered. Kubrick purchased the rights to the book and based a lot of the film from the ideas in the novel. The novel was written as a serious narrative, but Kubrick thought the subject would not be believable if it was a straight drama, and instead made the film a satire comedy.
Yeah.
Kubrick's longtime producer, James Harris, disagreed with that decision, which ultimately led to their split as business partners.
Even though a lot of the humor doesn't translate for me personally, I definitely agree with the choice to make it a comedy than a drama, because everything about the nuclear arms race, like, is kind of absurd. It's like a point of, like, there's nothing we can do about this. You can't be too serious about it, and it kind of has to become a joke.
Yeah, that's true. Either that or make it a monster movie. Harris would go on to produce a serious Cold War film, which was called The Bedford Incident. One of the first ideas Kubrick and George came up with was to create a film within a film, framed by an alien intelligence, and was titled The Delicate Balance of Terror. That idea was scrapped. Just before filming, Kubrick hired Terry Southern, a journalist and satirical author, to help punch up the script and fill it in with sexual innuendos.
It's incredibly obvious, isn't it? A foreign substance is introduced into our precious bodily fluids without the knowledge of the individual, certainly without any choice. That's the way a hardcore commie works.
When it came to the production, because of the film's potential nature and visual effects, the production had to move to England. When the film was released, it definitely caused an explosion of controversy and mixed reactions from critics. Some of them understood the message Kubrick was trying to convey, while others thought it was a mockery of the U.S. Defense Forces. Kubrick responded to the criticism by saying, quote, "A satirist is someone who has a very skeptical view of human nature, but who still has the optimism to make some sort of joke out of it, however brutal the joke might be." For Kubrick's next film, it was going to be the biggest and boldest production yet. 2001, A Space Odyssey, which came out in 1968. For Kubrick, he spent 5 years just developing the movie. The idea for the film came from a collaboration between Kubrick and science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke. When they first met, Kubrick told Clarke that he wanted to make his next film about, quote, man's relationship to the universe, according to Clarke. So Clarke went off with his new assignment and wrote 6 short stories. Of those 6, Kubrick chose the one that he wanted to base his film on, which was called The Sentinel. The two of them expanded the story and eventually created the plot.
I always find it fascinating when a movie is like based off of an author's work, but the movie and what it's based off of are kind of being created simultaneously. I mean, that's a thing that happened with Scott Pilgrim. That's a thing that happened with Jurassic Park. This idea of the film and the book, it's sort of based off of actually like being created in conversation with each other is always so interesting. I remember hearing that 2001 was based off of a book, or I didn't realize a short story, but I didn't realize how those things were kind of created in tandem with each other.
Yeah, the short story wouldn't have happened if Stanley Kubrick wasn't like, hey, write something that I want to make a movie about. And sure enough, he just went out and wrote something, and Stanley was like, I like it.
Yeah.
Let's make a movie on that.
I could be wrong about Jurassic Park, but I feel like my memory is that the film rights to that were sold before the book had even been finished being written. And so the movie was going into production like before the book was even released. I could be mistaken, though.
I know we talked about it in our Jurassic Park 4 episode.
Right.
I forget exactly the story. Check out our Jurassic Park 4 episode if you want to know the actual history.
Absolutely.
So Clarke's short story, Encounter in the Dawn, was used to inspire the Dawn of Man opening scene. When writing the script, the two referred to the project as How the Solar System Was Won. And in February 1956, in a press release, Kubrick announced that the title of the film would be Journey Beyond the Stars. Other potential titles included Universe, Tunnel to the Stars, and Planetfall.
Planetfall is a terrible title.
That's like Moonfall.
Yeah, that is awful. How the Solar System Was Won, that's a title that I want to see used in something. Like, I can see how they were, like, talking about it for that one part of the movie. That's a fun, evocative title, you know, How the West Was Won and everything.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like that. I want to see something released that actually uses that as a title.
How the Solar System Was Won seems like a space race movie between the US and Russia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The original plan was to co-write the novel 2001 with no constraints, then write the screenplay based on the book. But instead, both the novel and the script were written at the same time. In a 1970 interview, Kubrick explained the difference between the book and the movie, stating, quote, "There are a number of differences between the book and the movie. The novel, for example, attempts to explain things with much more complexity than the film does, which is inevitable in a verbal medium." So one of the examples that I found was that where the book and the movie diverge is the monolith that you see in the Dawn of Man scene. So in the book, there's a clear explanation as to what it is and where it came from and what its purpose is, where in the movie, it's just a visual mystery, which you can kind of connect to the next part of the movie.
Which is something that you can get away with in a movie when you can't necessarily get away with it in a book as much, especially in a science fiction book. I think that's one of the things that really works well for 2001. I really like kind of weird, trippy sci-fi where it's just like, it doesn't explain everything. You know, 2001 is, you know, one of the blueprints for a lot of those kinds of movies. I think what Kubrick says there about where the book and the film differ absolutely makes a ton of sense, and is one of the strengths of filmmaking, is that like you can show images and create a vibe without explaining something in a literal sense, but it can still make sense in an emotional sense and still connect with an audience.
I have the novelization of Battle Royale, and there's an interesting foreword that talks about the purpose of novelizations and how to structure them and how they're relevant to this day. Because the reason for novelizations originally was the fact that personal viewing devices like VCRs, they weren't readily available.
Yeah.
So the best way for them to relive that experience was through novelizations.
Yeah, absolutely.
But novelizations are still being made today. So what's the purpose of making these books or writing these books if you can readily rewatch these movies today? And he defends the argument in this forward, saying that in the book, you can dive deeper than you did in the movie. You can dive into what this character was thinking about in that moment. You can have a brief history of that character in just that one scene, something that you wouldn't really be able to provide in the movie. So the purpose of a novelization is to dive deeper into the characters and their thoughts and their history rather than what you would get in just the film itself.
Have I talked about the Revenge of the Sith novelization on this podcast before?
No.
So, Revenge of the Sith novelization is incredible. It's really, 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 really good. And it does exactly what you're saying of being able to dive into things that the movie can't. And specifically, what the Revenge of the Sith novelization does so well is diving into character motivations and character mindsets in a way that makes that movie a million times better. Like, I really, really enjoy Revenge of the Sith. And I think in large part it's because I have the story that was told in the novelization in my head when I watched that movie. For example, at the beginning of the movie, you've got the whole going into the spaceship to rescue the Chancellor from Count Dooku. In the novelization, they have a scene with Count Dooku and Palpatine before Anakin and Obi-Wan show up where they are discussing their evil Sith plans. And Count Dooku, the plan is, I am kidnapping the Chancellor, and then Anakin and Obi-Wan are going to come and rescue the Chancellor and capture me to give Anakin even more good things in the public side. But Count Dooku thought, oh, this is going to end with me being arrested and brought to Coruscant. And so then it gets to the scene where he's on his knees and Anakin has a lightsaber to his neck and Palpatine says, kill him. And then there's a look in the movie that goes across Count Dooku's eyes. And in the novelization, it's his realization of, oh, I'm being betrayed right now. I should have known this was going to happen. Of course Palpatine doesn't want me captured. Of course he wants me killed. And it's this realization of like, oh, I thought this was going to go one way and I completely messed up. So now when I watch Revenge of the Sith, that look that Christopher Lee gives is not, oh, I'm going to die. It's more than that. It's a, oh, I just got duped by my master and I'm such a fool for not realizing that I would have been duped. The novelization is full of stuff like that in a way that makes that movie actively better. There's a lot of Star Wars fans who will put Revenge of the Sith up there on tier with original trilogy even, and I think a large part of that is because of that novelization. Novelization is really, really good.
There you go, kids. Read the novelization of your favorite movie.
Yeah. Or read a novelization for a movie you didn't love as much, and maybe the novelization is going to make it better.
Yes. Also, I know that with a lot of these novelizations, they will go in tandem with the production so that by the time the book is being released, they will release it around the time that the movie is being released.
Yep.
And a lot of times those authors will base it on the original script that's given to them. So if any scenes are cut out of the movie, a lot of those cut scenes and deleted scenes are included in the novelization.
Which is really funny when it comes to Revenge of the Sith, because there's the character Shaak Ti, who's a Jedi. She dies in one way in the novelization, and then they filmed a different scene with her dying in a different way in Revenge of the Sith that was also cut out of that movie. And so then they did a different version of her dying in a different book or something, and basically there's 4 different times that this one character dies because they kept changing how she dies in the script, and then in the final version, she's not even in it. That's a fun thing that happens as well.
That's fun. Now I need to read this. I want to get this now.
You should. There's a Twitter page that is just tweeting out sections from the book. There's also so much poetry to the writing. Specifically, it's very flowery descriptions of these epic conflicts of good and evil, and the way that it's written is very much like, this is the most important story that's ever been told, but in a way that like works, and you're like, heck yeah, this battle of good and evil is incredible and meaningful. You should read it. It's good. It's good.
Yeah. What are we on? Oh, yeah, 2001. So the tension between Clark and Kubrick, it eventually ended. Clark and Kubrick, they received screenwriting credit, while Clark received sole credit for the novel. Originally, it was actually going to be both of their names. At one point, Kubrick tried replacing Clark and attempted hiring new writers, which they all declined the offer.
Wow.
According to Michael Benson's book about the making of the film, Kubrick wanted Clark to write entirely new plotline that stems from the various scenes from the film. Clark agreed to do this, but wanted to make the plot lines into separate publications, which Kubrick did not want.
Huh, weird.
Yeah.
Why would that be your sticking point, Kubrick? That's such a, like, to some degree, I get his obsessiveness on camera. I don't agree with his methods most of the time, but, like, I understand where that's coming from. Why are you being so weirdly obsessive over how somebody releases their book? That's where it goes to a level of, like, you're just a power-hungry madman, maybe.
Yeah, he just wants a sense of control in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And if someone says no to him, then he just throws a tantrum rather than trying to compromise
Kubrick.
or think it through.
Come on.
Something to note is how detailed-oriented Kubrick is when it came to the accuracy of how to depict living in space and extraterrestrial intelligence.
Yeah.
Kubrick was hoping to avoid the cliche and campy depictions of space seen in previous sci-fi films. Instead, Kubrick used two educational films as research and inspiration. There was Universe, a 1960 animated short documentary from the National Film Board of Canada.
In all of time, on all the planets of all the galaxies in space, what civilizations have risen, looked into the night, seen what we see, asked the questions that we ask.
And To the Moon and Beyond, which came from 1964's New York's World's Fair. It actually went beyond inspiration when Kubrick hired one of the special effects artists that worked on the short Universe, Wally Gentleman, to work briefly on the film, and hired the short's narrator, Douglas Rain, to voice Hal.
Huh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. Kubrick also hired the production company behind To the Moon and Beyond, Graphic Films Corporation. They came on to be design consultants for 2001. Prior to that, they were making specialty films for NASA, the U.S. Air Force, and other aerospace clients. They provided research on the mechanics and physics of space travel and even created storyboards for the space flight sequences. From the corporation came Douglas Trumbull, who was hired to be the special effects supervisor, someone that we brought up before when we covered our Dune episode.
Yeah, I was about to say, that name sounds familiar.
As for the extraterrestrials, Clark and Kubrick consulted with Carl Sagan. Sagan advised that they suggest extraterrestrial superintelligence and not to depict it. Kubrick interpreted it as these beings are beyond physical form and are pure energy and spirit.
Yeah.
So the behind the scenes and concepts of 2001 go far beyond what I've covered, and there have been books and documentaries that cover this subject alone. And if we did cover the behind the scenes of 2001, we'd be here for like hours.
Yeah,
so we're
that
not
could
gonna
be
do that.
like a whole podcast to itself, just an ongoing series of just the making of that movie.
And I'm sure there are.
You could probably do that for like most Kubrick films of just like, you could spend 12 episodes talking about the making of probably any one of his movies.
Yeah. But what I wanted to reveal was Kubrick's work ethic and dedication to his craft, because much of that applies to when he took on his next film, a historical biopic about Napoleon Bonaparte. Kubrick had a great fascination for the former French leader, stating that his life was, quote, an epic poem of action. More from Kubrick, quote, he was one of those rare men who moved history and molded the destiny of their own times and of generations to come.
Yeah.
Kubrick would not be the first filmmaker to portray Napoleon on the silver screen. There was Abel Grace's Napoleon, which came out in 1927. In a remastered Blu-ray trailer, they quote Kubrick stating that it's, quote, a masterpiece of cinematic invention. But the full quote is actually, I know that this film is a masterpiece of cinematic invention and it brought cinematic innovators to the screen, which are still being called innovations whenever someone is bold enough to try them again. But on the other hand, as a Napoleon film, I have always been disappointed in it.
Huh.
Yeah. This interview came from the spring 1972 issue of Sight and Sound. There was also the film Désirée, which came out in 1954, which starred Marlon Brando as Napoleon.
Of course.
I judge my conduct by my conscience, and my conscience is not troubled. Day by day, I too gave my life for my country. And yet, my mother did not wish me to become emperor. She did not even attend my coronation.
There was also the Russian-produced 4-part film adaptation of War and Peace, which was released in 1966 to 67, which primarily covers Napoleon's invasion into Russia, primarily told from the Russian perspective. For Kubrick, he didn't think that properly portrayed who Napoleon truly was. From the Sight and Sound interview again, the interview asked, you made Clockwork Orange intentionally because you had to postpone your Napoleon project. How do you see the Napoleon film developing? Kubrick states, first of all, I start from the premise that there have never been a great historical film, and I say that with all apologies and respect to those who have made historical films, including myself.
There's never been a great historical film. Huh.
Yep. I don't think anyone has ever successfully solved the problem of dealing in an interesting way with the historical information that has to be conveyed, and at the same time getting a sense of reality about the daily life of the characters. I have to get a feeling of what it is like to be with Napoleon. At the same time, you have to convey enough historical information in an intelligent, interesting, and concise way so that the audience understands what happened.
That is a very interesting quote, and I have a lot of opinions on that, but I want to wait and see what Kubrick tries to do. Like, what are you going to do with a historical epic after saying this? I'm very curious to see how these two ideas get reckoned. I've got some opinions on what I think makes a good biopic, what I think makes a good historical thing. Anything based off of a true story, based off of a true person, there's certain things that I think work and other things that I think don't work. You're laying out the problem there, Kubrick. I've got an opinion on what I think the solution is, but I'm curious what Kubrick's solution is, if there is one.
Yeah, I mean, we'll find out. So the film was picked up by MGM, and pre-production began in 1967. For Kubrick, and the help of many assistants, he wanted to find as much information on Napoleon that was available. Kubrick's assistant, Andrew Birkin, who would later become a professional screenwriter, was sent with a team to France to gather as much information about Napoleon as they could. For Birkin, he arrived at a very dangerous time, around May of 1968, during the Student Revolution. There was protests in the streets, and police were shooting students. Nonetheless, he carried on and got photos of any artifact that were owned by Napoleon, which included his portable toilet. Archived about 15,000 location scouting photos and around 17,000 slides of Napoleonic imagery. He even brought back soil samples from where the Battle of Waterloo took place, so that when they filmed, they could match the color of the ground.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's some Kubrick-level perfectionism.
Kubrick would buy thousands of books in multiple languages, just anything that contained a bit of a window into Napoleon's life. To help organize his research, Kubrick had a filing cabinet, something that resembled a Dewey Decimal System cabinet that you could find in a public library, that would catalog Napoleon's entire life. You could actually just throw out a random date, and in the cabinet, you can pull out a card that would tell you where Napoleon was, what he was doing, and why he was doing it on that day.
Wow.
Yeah. Kubrick knew that this could potentially be an expensive movie. When we go through the script synopsis, you'll see that a lot of the focus is not on the battles, but a lot of what happens between the battles and lifestyles that Napoleon lived. When there were battle scenes, Kubrick proposed that extras, especially those who would be seen in the distance, would be outfitted with paper costumes. So they could be accurate to the time period, but would be relatively inexpensive to make. It was estimated that they would have to provide proper outfits for about 4,000 extras in the foreground, but the background they would provide anywhere from 10 to 100,000 extras with paper costumes. Kubrick even did a camera test with the outfits, and the difference was not noticeable. The majority of the film, Kubrick was planning on shooting in France and Italy. For the battle scenes, the plan was to film in Romania and Yugoslavia. With the assistance of the Romanian People's Army, they offered about 40,000 soldiers and 10,000 cavalrymen to be extras in the battle scenes, and they would be fitted with the paper costumes. Yugoslavia also offered the use of their army as well. Something that would have been impossible to film is any scenes that would have taken place in all of the palaces, especially the Tuileries Palace. It wasn't a matter of location costs, but they would never be allowed any filming inside any of them. To solve the issue, Kubrick proposed building partial sets with the front projection technology that they used in 2001, the Dawn of Man scene, to complete the background, filmed similarly to how we do green screen or projection screen sets today.
Sure.
To portray Napoleon, Kubrick first wanted Jean-Paul Belmondo or David Hemmings, but the role would lastly be offered to... Actually, I'm going to have you guess. Who do you think he wanted to play Napoleon Bonaparte?
This is late 60s, early 70s?
Yeah.
Is it an actor he had worked with before?
It is an actor that he's going to work with in the future.
Oh, okay. Is it going to be Ryan O'Neal, since that's who he makes Barry Lyndon with?
Nope.
Okay. I want to keep guessing then. Malcolm McDowell would have been a weird choice. Jack Nicholson would have been too young, right? That was before Jack Nicholson was a thing. I don't know. Who was it?
Jack Nicholson.
It was Jack Nicholson.
Yep.
Wow.
At the time, he was a relatively unknown actor, and Kubrick had seen him in Easy Rider, which came out in 1969.
That's right.
And he thought he would be a good fit.
That's so interesting that he wanted to cast Jack Nicholson as an unknown, and then when he does work with Jack Nicholson in The Shining, that's when he's already got a pretty decently established career. Like,
he saw something in that kid way early.
Because that's like after stuff like Chinatown and stuff, right? Chinatown came out before The Shining.
I think so.
Interesting. Huh, very cool.
Yeah. So the story behind Jack Nicholson is that Kubrick ended up calling Nicholson, and at first he thought it was a prank. But after realizing that it was actually Kubrick, he had him read a few lines from a play to see if he was right for the role. For Napoleon's muse, Josephine, Kubrick wanted Audrey Hepburn.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love the idea that Kubrick is calling up Jack Nicholson and be like, hey, I want you for my movie. Oh, okay, but can you give me an audition right now and cold read these lines? I don't know if that's the way it was or if that was like two separate meetings, but the way you said it there, Dan, makes it sound like it was just one phone call. It's just like, okay, now give me some dry read acting for me.
I think he already had his mind set. He just wanted to make sure, like...
He just wanted to double check.
He just wanted to double check, like, make sure this guy's not an idiot. Then the other thing he was probably thinking of was, like, he needed this to be a low-cost movie. And a lot of costs go to the main character, the main actor.
Yep.
And if it's a relatively unknown, you don't have to pay them as much.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's going on here. But yeah, he wanted Audrey Hepburn. Hepburn would turn down the role. There was actually a letter that she wrote to Stanley Kubrick, politely rejecting. There has been speculation that because there's so much sex in the movie, she was like, I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
But she politely declined. Other actors that were supposed to be in the supporting roles were Peter O'Toole, Alec Guinness, and Charlotte Rampling.
Yeah, when you were asking about actors he was considering, I was thinking about Peter O'Toole just because he's the epic guy. I think he could have done a great job at playing a figure like Napoleon.
Yeah, he definitely would have. But as far as I could find in the research, they were just supporting roles.
Yeah.
But none of their roles were specific.
It's very much like, let's go look at what David Lean's got going on.
Yeah,
Peter O'Toole, check. Alec Guinness, check. Let's do it.
Yeah. The script that we're going to go through This is supposedly the first script that Stanley Kubrick had written on his own.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Something to keep in mind is that Stanley Kubrick, not a great screenwriter.
Yeah, like if we think of a lot of auteurs now, a lot of those people like to write and direct their own script. Like especially when we get into like 90s indie filmmakers, you got a lot of people who are wanting to write and direct. When we think of an auteur now, we think of Paul Thomas Anderson writes and directs. Christopher Nolan is co-writing and directing, and usually that other co-writer is his brother. That is one of the things that always kind of jumped out to me, that Kubrick is not a guy who wrote his own stuff.
Yeah. It's like how Brian Wilson is like a genius musical composer. But when it comes to lyrics, he just can't do it for whatever reason. And he brought in someone else to write lyrics for him.
Yeah.
Kubrick's kind of the same way, whereas he has a great sense of the story, how to portray it, how to put it on the screen. But as far as like writing goes, that's his downfall. Again,
Yeah.
genius is relative.
Well, okay, I should say, because I'm looking at his IMDb right now, he does have screenplay by credit for a lot of his movies, but it's usually with another screenwriter, or it's screenplay by, but based off of a novel by.
Yeah. This is not to say that the movie is not going to be great. Reading through the scripts, it does seem like he leaves out a lot of basic details, like dates, for example. Like, I had to look up like where we were externally from the script to figure out like where we are on the timeline as I was trying to actually put the synopsis together. And I started like inserting them in there just so that I would not get lost while trying to make this. Yeah. Also, this is not considered a final draft. Like I said, this is one of the first drafts that he made. Had the script actually gone into the rehearsal stage, a lot of the script may have been changed and may have been condensed, or he might have brought in like an actual screenwriter to put this all together, but who knows?
Now, how many pages is this screenplay?
It is 147.
Okay, that's not as long as I was expecting.
The movie was estimated to be 3 hours long.
Yeah, which makes sense that 147-page Kubrick script is going to be 3 hours long.
Yeah.
But I was expecting like 200-page script.
No, but it was very dense to get through.
Yeah.
The script that I found that I'm basing the synopsis on is a compilation of Kubrick script. There's a lot of like multiple handwritten alterations, which was then put together. Someone had actually like digitized it all and put it into a PDF, and that's what I transcribed.
Gotcha.
But before we get into the script, we are going to take another break for advertisements. And we're back.
And hopefully with those advertisements, you can find the tools you need to make your own sprawling Napoleon biopic.
Yeah.
You got to figure out a way to feed your crew, and you got to use whatever meal service was advertising.
Yeah. Let's start getting into the script. We open on a 4-year-old Napoleon holding a teddy bear in a cradle next to his 5-year-old brother, Joseph, as their mother, Letizia, reads them a bedtime story. From a narrator, we are told that Napoleon was born on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, Croatia, and that he was not a healthy baby. From the voiceover from Napoleon, he says, quote, "My mother has always loved me. She would do anything for me." And then we cut to the main titles. We fast forward to when Napoleon is 9 and is attending school in Brienne. He wakes up in a dorm to a monk ringing a bell. It's so cold there that when he attempts to pour himself a glass of water, he thinks someone has put solid glass in the pitcher. Turns out he's never experienced ice before. Napoleon, as the narrator explains, that at 9 years old, he was enrolled in the Royal Military College and would be there for the next 5.5 years. We get a glimpse of young Napoleon, a loner with a book and lost in thought. When a classmate tries to talk with him, he is met with a stern "fuck off" from Napoleon. Another student bullies Napoleon by bumping into him, causing him to spill his milk. Napoleon throws his tin cup at the bully and proceeds to fight him. It's not explicitly said in the script, but it should be known that Napoleon spoke Corsican and Italian and didn't learn French until he started school. And even when he spoke French, he spoke in an accent and got made fun of it a lot. He was also short for his age, which also contributed to him being picked on.
Contributed to his Napoleon complex?
It might. Fast forward to a 16-year-old Napoleon graduating from Royal Military School. He's being fitted for his second lieutenant's uniform. Through narration, we learn that he was posted to the crack regiment de la Fière at Valence. We see him training with other young officers, where he's gained knowledge of multiple weapons and military strategies. In his free time, he's reading books about history, philosophy, and poetry. At 17, we see him with Caroline Colombier, who's 15 years old, in which he is flirting and eating freshly picked cherries with her. On another night, we see Napoleon wander the cold streets of Lyon, France, where he picks up a sex worker, Lisette Lecroix. Title on the screen, 1789, Revolution. At the town square were 300 peasants and town workers led by revolutionary leader Monsieur Varlac. Behind him, we see 6 severed heads stuck on pikes. The revolutionists are met with Napoleon on a horse with 25 French troops. Napoleon gets off his horse and walks up to speak with Varlac. Napoleon is there to arrest Varlac for the murder of Monsieur de Boncy and his son, and burning down his chateau. Varlac claims he is innocent and that the killings were necessary. Napoleon pleads with him to come with him where Varlac will face trial, but Varlac refuses. Napoleon gives him to the count of 5 to comply, or he will be executed. Varlac stands his ground. Napoleon counts to 5 and shoots Varlac in the head and informs the crowd to go home. I will say that there is a lot of French names in here, and I don't speak French, so I'm going to have a very difficult time pronouncing all of these. At the Tuileries Palace, revolutionaries break into the palace and force Louis XI, Marie Antoinette, and their children out onto the balcony for the crowd to see. The revolutionaries open a bottle of champagne and share it with the royal couple as one of the men puts his dirty red stocking cap on the king's head. Napoleon is appalled and sees the king as weak. In the summer of 1793, France is in the midst of a civil war. The naval base at Toulon was taken over by the royalist insurrection. The port was then handed over to British and Spanish fleets. To take back the port was a French army of 10,000 led by the inexperienced General Carteau. In their headquarters tent, the generals go over the plan. Napoleon is there as the captain of artillery. It appears that the French forces are too weak to go up against the English. Napoleon speaks up and suggests that they only need to capture Fort Agoulet. In the next scene, we see the French flag being raised at French Agoulet, with Napoleon on a white horse shouting over to the troops. After the successful takeover of the port, Napoleon is commissioned to Brigadier General in a formal ceremony at Toulon Field. His mother is there watching from the stands. In July of 1794, we witnessed the death of Maximilien Robespierre, which was the end of the revolutionary reign of terror. At the Paul Barras Salon in Paris, elites, politicians, war contractors, and high-ranking officials drink, gamble, and fuck. Napoleon is in the middle of the chaos, uninterested in the festivities. Instead, he has his eye on Josephine de Beauharnais. He heads to the bar, where the bartender reveals that Paul Barras, a politician, made his riches from crooked war contracts, and that every night he has sex with 2 different people. The gender doesn't matter. He sees him enter the saloon and kiss Josephine. In the music room, a play begins where the actors openly have intercourse on stage. Napoleon sits by himself as he witnesses Josephine, sitting next to Barras, whisper something into his ear. So the next day, we see 2 mobs in the streets of Paris. Between the 2 mobs are 2 generals. There's General Daniken and General Menu, who are sitting at a cafe. Daniken hands Menu a handwritten treaty. A narrator explains that a new political crisis is brewing. The moderate government of the convention, which came to power after the fall of Robespierre, soon showed itself to be inept, corrupt, and unpopular. It is now faced with a serious challenge from the royalists. General Menu sent out a deal with the mob, lost his nerve, and agreed to withdraw his troops from the section. That evening, Napoleon, Junot, and Marmont listened to the royalist speaker proclaim that they will be occupying the convention and will exterminate the, quote, hypocritical parasites, and ends his speech with, quote, "Long live the king." At night, Napoleon meets with Barras in his office at Tuileries. Barras informs Napoleon that they expect an attack on the convention tomorrow morning. Barras states that fighting off the mob is not possible with the troops and weapons that they have available. Napoleon thinks he can fight them off and convinces Barras to give him the authority to do so. The next day, Napoleon is ruthless when it comes to firing cannons and guns at the mob, killing many of them. Napoleon was made commander of the army of Italy and given his own headquarters in Paris. There we see him on his hands and knees looking over a large map of Italy that goes wall to wall on the floor. Other large maps cover the furniture. Marmot, Junot, and Berthier assist him with working out the marching routes. Eugene, who is the 16-year-old son of Josephine, he enters the room. It's revealed that Napoleon has put out an order that any citizens of Paris must seize any weapons in their possessions. Eugene has come to Napoleon to request that he may keep his father's sword as a keepsake. Napoleon personally returns the sword to Josephine at her home, but she was unaware that the sword even existed. That night, Napoleon and Josephine make love in her bedroom. In the next scene, we see Napoleon and Josephine getting married. In a voiceover from Josephine, it's revealed that she's not in love and her feelings of affection for him is lukewarm. Napoleon informs his mother of the union. She disapproves of it. In voiceover, we hear Napoleon reading his love letter to Josephine while the audience sees her having an affair with Captain Hippolyte Charles. Multiple times, Napoleon points out that Josephine is not writing him back. So right here is where we're actually going to end part 1 of Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon. In the next episode, we are going to complete the story and explain why this film was not made.
Excited to get into the rest of all of these French names.
Oh, God.
And find out what happened with this movie. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. If you want to find more episodes of this podcast, you can go check out our website, pipedreampodcasts.com. And while you're there, you can find links to all of our other shows, including Come On Fugue Pods, Pod Made You Special, and Escape from Vault Disney. While you're there, you can also find a link to our Patreon page. On our Patreon page, we have all sorts of rewards. For just $2 a month, you get a special monthly bonus show, as well as ad-free versions of recent episodes of our podcasts. For $5 a month, you get access to all of our archives ad-free, as well as getting access to Dan's notes on all of our episodes. So we're really, really appreciative of all of our Patreon supporters. Finally, you can follow us on social media. We're on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made. We're on Twitter at HDTNGM. And you can send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com. Do you have more French names that you want Dan to try to pronounce?
No, don't.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Yeah, thank you.